we've had producers, long form and short form. Preachers, you've had a section. Now it's the turn of the bloggers. What a phenomenon. You know, 3-4 years ago, who would have thought this would have taken off in the way it has? It seems that within each of us, people used to say there's a book. Well, there's certainly a blog in everybody. And out there in the blogosphere, boy, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of blogs. How do you decide which one to go for? How do you get your point across succinctly? How do you market it? What do you do when you know you want to say something, that what you want to say from your organization needs and should be heard? Well, we put a panel together for you of some of the top bloggers around in the interfaith section in America. And leading them, and this is where I get a break because this gentleman will take my seat for this one, but we have what the Huffington Post called one of the most influential bloggers in Judaism in America, Joshua Stanton. Could you please take the stage and join with your panel? Thanks, Josh. Yep.
So it is so exciting to be here today for quite a few reasons. And one of them is that Odyssey has long been at the forefront of media and remains so also in blogging. Right now, there are about 2 billion people online. And of those, they visit 300 million websites. But the driving force right now in everything that we do online is really blogging. The reason for that is the types of personal narratives that emerge, the way in which we tell our own stories, those of our organizations, and those of really our societies and cultures. So it's my pleasure to be with some of the top bloggers in the country of different religious traditions to talk about blogging in a multi-faith world. So right now I'd love to invite up Simranjit Singh and Khurram Zaman to come join me up here. We also have the pleasure of Verity Jones and also Joseph Ward, who will be joining us by way of phone. Just a couple of brief words about my fellow bloggers here. So Simranjit Singh has an amazing blog that followed him, particularly about the New York City Marathon, and he is up at Columbia University. And Khurram Zaman has been working with the Unity Productions Foundation and has really especially focused on combating Islamophobia in the country. Verity Jones, who is joining us by phone, is with Union Theological Seminary's New Media Project. And Joseph Ward is with Believe Out Loud, which is championing LGBTQ rights on the internet and within religious communities. So please join me in welcoming them. And we're going to do this a little bit like a blog of our own in some ways. So that was the introduction, and now we're going to give everybody about 2 minutes to talk about their own experience and how blogging has shaped their work, has changed what they do, has shifted their practices, and influenced their organizations. Then after that, we're going to all join in a Q&A, and much like we would on blogs, comment very briefly, and also engage the bloggers in conversation. So Simran, I don't know if you'd be willing to start us off.
My story really begins a few months ago. I'm new to blogging. I've been writing for a while. Last summer, I was selected by ING as one of their six featured runners for the New York City Marathon. And part of that entailed a daily blog that they asked me to keep. At first, I was really nervous. I felt, putting my thoughts out there made me feel very vulnerable. But as I started to think about it, I realized what an amazing opportunity this was for me and my community. Coming from the Sikh tradition, it's a very easily identifiable minority community and one that has been subjected to hate crimes and mistaken identity for quite some time. And so I realized that this would be a great opportunity to provide a voice for that community that's been missing in the media. So that's where I started, and as I accepted, I started thinking about the kind of impact I wanted to have and what my objectives were. And one of the few objectives I decided on was to focus on challenging stereotypes and complicating people's misconceptions. Since I was a kid, my experiences and the way people have constructed me have been informed by the media when I was in elementary school. Operation Desert Storm, so I was Saddam. When I was, well, soon after that, thank God, Disney came out with Aladdin. So although that was problematic in itself, at least it was positive, so I was happy. So yeah, and as everyone would know, the last several years have been particularly difficult for many people who look like me. And so this was one of my objectives, and I did this by discussing openly my own negotiations of identity, or talking about really mundane, boring daily life stuff that just showed I was normal. And a lot of this, my background, I have a bit of background in humor writing, so a lot of this I did through humor. My other point really was, or my other objective was to inspire people. And this is very cliche, and it sounded kind of lame to me actually when I decided on it, but 77.5% of young sick boys in Queens experience bullying, and it's not like kind of pushing, it's like hospitalization, it's setting turbans on fire, all sorts of things. And so I thought if I could provide them a glimpse of what it's like to be a normal person living in America and having a normal life, I thought that would be a great goal that I could provide. So those are kind of my two objectives that I've been able to accomplish with writing, particularly through blogging.
Well, thank you so much. And it's my pleasure to invite Khurram to speak next. And blogging is really a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week endeavor. And Khurram just got married on Saturday and is here with us engaging in this meta blog of sorts about blogging itself. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's actually kind of an interesting story how I met my wife. It talks about social media. We have known each other for 2 years, and randomly on Facebook we had a conversation a little while ago, and we really kind of hit it off. So I can safely thank Facebook for helping me get married on Saturday. And it's really interesting, I think, that we live in times of great transformation, and we don't really realize what's happening until we can kind of stop and look at how young people and old people are talking about these transformations. And I went to a career fair at my wife's school, and I had to speak in front of every single grade that was there. And there was kindergartners there, and I had to explain to them kind of what I do. And I asked them, like, how many of you know what Facebook and Twitter is? Because I was trying to figure out how to explain digital media to them. And believe it or not, the majority of the kids knew what it was. And it says, yeah, I'm on there. Well, I'm on my parents' profile, So these were like 5-year-olds. And then I went on home like later that week, and I had to get on LinkedIn. And I just came across my father's LinkedIn profile, and he's like 70 years old. He's a pharmacist. And I was like, this is a 7-year-old who's on LinkedIn. He was there 2 years before I was, and I'm like, these 5-year-olds who know what Facebook and Twitter is, and I was just like, this is, in Arabic we say it's ajib, it's strange, it's like a very strange thing. So we don't really know how powerful these tools are until we can kind of stop and see how they're going. And that was kind of my experience with blogging. I've always been a faith-based activist for as long as I can remember. Since at least high school, I was inspired by my tradition to speak on matters of justice and seeking to empower those that were powerless. I got into blogging when I was in college because that was something that kind of my friends were doing. And at first it was sort of like, hey, I had Wheaties for breakfast. This is great. I read Dune. It was really trippy, And I didn't really see the connection between faith and activism and blogging until this issue came up. And I was the president of the Muslim Student Association in my college, and there's a national organization called the Muslim Student Association National, MSA National. And they had an election, and it was very questionable. And I was going on the legal track, and I actually looked at the Constitution because it had nothing better to do with my time. I was poli-sci philosophy. And I realized that the election wasn't in accordance with their Constitution. And this was like a college organization, so it wasn't very organized. But I was really upset about it. I decided to blog about it. And lo and behold, several other bloggers of the Muslim faith wrote about it as well. And before we knew it, this organization had a fiasco in its hand. And dozens of people started writing about it, and the comments were thousands of posts were made about it. And finally, MSA National contacted us and said, we want to have a conference call with you. And we were just sort of like these college kids who were playing StarCraft or whatever. And they set up a meeting with us. We gave them a list of recommendations, and they were heartfelt. We told them this is what the Constitution says. This is how the election was conducted. We advise you do this, this, and this. And they actually went about and implemented a lot of the recommendations. And then that was when I first realized that blogging is a very, very powerful tool. And we live in times where there's this tremendous amount of media fragmentation, and the traditional institutions of power are their power is being distributed to people like you and me, and you can see with just a post or two you can influence tremendous change. The latest, I think, example of how blogging can be useful is when the Lowe's controversy happened with the TV show All American Muslim, and they decided to pull their ad revenue from the show because they came under pressure because they were portraying Muslims in a normal light. And so I was, I wrote about this on Facebook, and I invited people to join a community call. And this was not restricted to just people of the Muslim faith, people from any faith. And so it was myself and a handful of like 40 activists around the country. And we got together and we started organizing protests around the country. We got together some petitions. Josh and Frankie had put together a petition via Religious Freedom USA. And it became a very big movement very quickly. Russell Simmons got on board and so on and so forth. So that's just, to me, it's something that we take that it doesn't take that much time to do. And when I blog, it's not like, I don't consider myself a writer. I just sort of like do very stream of consciousness. And I'll go back like a year later and say, oh, I made all these typos. And so it's an amazing tool. It's remarkably simple, and as long as you're consistent and your message is great, you can actually make a lot of change. And so those are my experience with faith-based blogging and activism. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And it's now our pleasure to invite some of those who will be chiming in by way of telephone. So I'd like to invite the Reverend Verity Jones of Union Theological Seminary's New Media Project to talk about her experiences with blogging.
Thank you, Josh, and good afternoon. I direct a project at Union Theological Seminary called the New Media Project, and the New Media Project has a community of bloggers on our website, a community of bloggers made up from our 6 research fellows and then those from the 6 case studies that we've been basing much of our work on, and a number of guest bloggers as well. And one of the stories that I wanted to share goes in a little bit of a different direction than our 2 previous speakers. The case study that I focused on was a case study of the Young Clergy Women's Project. And this is an online network for clergy women under the age of 40. The project began as a password-protected community blog in 2006. And now the group of almost 600 members use numerous social media tools to build and maintain the network, including a public e-zine. But the privacy afforded by parts of the network continues to be very important to them. The network arose because so many young clergy women are serving in locations that are geographically isolated from other young clergy women. One member tells us that in her local ministerial group, she is not just the only woman in the room, but also the only person under the age of 55. And religious professionals of all kinds, especially those who may be serving in isolated areas, need support and collegiality, friendship, in order to survive and thrive in their call. And the Young Clergy Women Project provides that safe environment for young clergy women who need to explore their vocational and personal questions outside of the critical eye of their public. Without the network, many of them would feel very much alone. And the privacy has become an important part of the overall advocacy that the group provides for young clergy women.
Thank you so much, Verity. And Joseph, it would be wonderful to hear your reflections as well.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks, everyone. It's really great to be a part of this conversation. So I think my own blogging experience really started with some work around international human rights as it related to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. I've always been interested in storytelling, and so blogging has really helped me kind of execute that interest and that passion. And what I found was, as I was really starting to, unravel and wrap my head around some of the issues that were going on in parts of the world where the intersections of faith and LGBT rights are very contentious or often in conflict, I started to really discover for myself this really powerful network of NGOs, of faith leaders, activists just around the world who are working on this issue. But in many cases, they weren't really working in partnership with each other. They were working in these silos for a number of different types of reasons, capacities, political reasons, just the nature of the specific issue. But my work with Believe Out Loud is very similar to sort of that exposure, in that Believe Out Loud is a campaign here in the U.S. That looks at a group of national organizations who are working towards welcome and affirmation of the LGBT community in faith settings, and trying to create some neutral space for conversation and some very unique entry points for individuals into what is really often a very sensitive conversation. So what we do is, the large part of our programming is actually blogging, and we provide a platform at believeoutloud.com where we pull together voices from our partner organizations, which include mainline denominational groups, academics, other laypersons, activists, journalists. We pull together all of these diverse voices that are working within this specific faith, this specific space, and provide them with the Believe Out Loud platform to really amplify that message. So blogging has been both personal in terms of really helping me connect with the issues that I work with and understand networks that are out there, and also just very practical in terms of just what we do at Believe Out Loud on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph. And so some of the themes that we heard, Verity talked about the ability of blogs to provide mutual support for communities that are geographically diffuse. Joseph talked about interorganizational collaboration. Khurram talked about community organizing, using blogs in particular. And Simran talked about combating stereotypes through personal narrative. Now, we were supposed to have one additional panelist, Rabbi Rachel Kahn-Traster, who unfortunately was not able to join us. But I wanted to bring in just one more element that I see as very salient from blogging, and that is the international element, where all of a sudden you're not just in conversation with people around the corner from you, but people around the world. My experience with this took place when I was studying in Jerusalem, and it was in a very tough time, a time of heightened tension in the Middle East. And I wrote an article for the University of Chicago's Sightings publication, an online publication. And it was about how Jews and Muslims had lived together in harmony during the 12th century in what was then Muslim-controlled Spain, Al-Andalus. I received a letter, by way of my Gmail account about 2 weeks later or so from an Iraqi journalist. And he said, "Oh my goodness, you've got to tell me more about this. I'd never heard of this history. This is news to me." Now, I don't have a map in front of me, but I'm aware that Israel is about 1 or maybe 2 countries at war away from Iraq. And we were somehow, because of the internet and because of blogging, able to have a conversation that would have never been possible. A couple of interviews later with this Iraqi journalist, and lo and behold, there was a big news story in northern Iraq that week, and that was Jews and Muslims live together in peace. Now, in some ways, this is 800-year-old news, 850-year-old news, but it seemed innovative because a conversation was able to take place that never could have before. So I think there's also a very international element to blogging. Now, the most exciting part, I would have to say, though, is the dialogical aspect, that people are in communication and in conversation. So it's my pleasure now to invite you to ask questions that you may have about blogging for a multi-faith world, or some of the comments that some of the panelists made. So please feel free to raise your hand and then ask a question. Yes?
My question has to do with getting readership. It sounds like in most of these cases there was, you were working or someone was working out of a built-in network that, of readers that may have increased over time. But what happens if you don't have that built-in network to start off with? How do you build your readership? Because the kind of effect that you were talking about in terms of the television show or in terms of the Constitution came about because a lot of people read it and there was mass. How do you build your readership?
How do you build your readership, and how can you as an individual become an effective blogger? Khurram, you're involved very much in community organizing through blogging, but also as an individual. And I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to that, and then Simran, if you could chime in as well.
Sure. I think there's two ways to discuss it. There's the content itself and how you write it, and then there's also the way that you distribute it. The content, the way that you write a blog is very different from how you would write in other forms of writing. Like I went to law school. If I wrote on my blog as I wrote as a law student, I would probably have very few readers. It would be very niche. So one thing I realized when I was writing was I was writing these very long articles. I did write a few articles about the Constitution, and I got very few comments on that. So what I found out was when I was breaking it down and the formatting of it, making it into sort of like subtitles, and then inviting people to participate by asking a question at the bottom. That's when I began to notice you could create your own sort of distribution network that way. Just writing interesting content in a way that stimulates dialogue, and sometimes writing about controversial subjects to get positions on both sides to engage in it. The second thing is to look at your distribution network. So WordPress, for example, is a great blog system to use because they have widgets that you can put a newsletter sign up on your blog. So what happened over time was that I just put this widget up just because it was like the standard widget, and people started subscribing to it. And at first, they're like, "Wow, this is really cool! Like people they're signing up to read my content. It's great." And then you kind of forget about it. And then like a year later, I looked at it and I had like hundreds of people that had subscribed to my blog, and I was like, "Wow, this is pretty cool." The same thing with Facebook and Twitter. Make sure that when you're syndicating it, your RSS feed is working, your widget is there, your Facebook is working, your Twitter is there. And the last thing I would recommend is if you cross-post from other blogs, it's sort of like I scratch my back, you scratch mine. So what happens is if you post content from other people's blogs, they'll post your content there as well. And eventually what happens is you build up a readership over time, and hopefully it'll be the readership that you engage. And what's beautiful about the internet is that you may come into blogging from a specific faith, and then when you build up enough of a readership, you'll realize that the people that are actually reading your blog are from a completely different perspective. I know that when the Lowe's boycott thing happened, my blogging is very traditional in terms of classical Islamic studies and contemporary politics. So most of the people that were commenting were basically of the Muslim faith. But when the Lowe's boycott happened, I started writing about that. Everyone that was commenting they were not of the Muslim faith, and so I had found out I had readership that was there that was just latent. And when the time came on a subject that they felt strongly about, that they participated in it. So
Simran, last word on this. What are your thoughts about how as an individual you can build a readership?
I'll keep it short. I know we're short on time, but what I found very helpful is to constantly keep your audience in mind and your readership. Mine in particular my interest has been young, college-educated, kind of the more moderate crowd, and I've been focused on Sikhs as well as non-Sikhs. But keeping that audience in mind is very helpful as you're constructing your thoughts and putting them together, I think, to keep a sort of consistent message framed in a way that people are constantly wanting more and consuming more.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you online.